The director of the National Committee for Education on Alcoholism, Mrs. Marty Mann.
Alcoholism has too long been a taboo subject, just as tuberculosis used to be 40 years ago. We're trying to teach people the truth, that alcoholism is a disease, and that because it is a disease, it should have no stigma attached to it. Alcoholics should be dealt with like other sick persons, in hospitals and clinics, not in jails. Alcoholism, America's fourth greatest public health problem, can be solved by community action. The National Committee stands ready to help your community plan such action.
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show, and that was a woman named Marty Mann, who was responsible not for creating AA or for writing the original literature about AA, but for making it go mainstream with a PR campaign that was pretty impressive even by today's standards. And that's what today's episode is about: 12-step programs, their religious roots, the lack of evidence to support their success, the damage done when they're pressed on people as a one-size-fits-all solution to issues of addiction, and the magic that went into creating something out of nothing, which is how the original 12 steps came to be. But I want to start today with a bit of a revealing story about me. In the winter of 2004, I was in the largest walled prison on Earth, Jackson, Michigan. I was locked in a one-man cell for 23 hours a day, waiting for an overburdened administration to finish my intake evaluation so I could move on to a low-level camp facility with open yards and more privileges. Now, this place was everything you've seen in the movies when it comes to prison structures. It was brick, it had steel bars, the cells were skinny enough that I could touch opposite walls at the same time. It was noisy as hell, with up to 300 people in each housing unit. It was cold, it was lonely, and it was so fucking boring. And things got bad. I was still adjusting to life at the time without a constant buzz from cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, or alcohol. That lack of stimulation was torture. So one night, after pacing for hours, doing push-ups, and still finding myself hours from sundown and far from worn out, I gave up and fell back on my Christian upbringing. In desperation, and in a moment of doubt, I prayed, God, if you're real, you better prove it now, because I can't do this. I might even have said it out loud. It was a shitty day. So I eventually went to bed, and I slept a few restless hours, the norm at that time. But something weird happened in the morning, although it wasn't so weird in hindsight. I honestly felt better, and I knew in my heart it was God, because what else could it be? Now, of course, if you've listened to the podcast much at all, you know that I don't currently think I felt better because the creator of the universe stopped what he was doing and chose me to bestow his hourly miracle upon. Far from it. Like most people who have a spiritual or religious experience, as a human, I'm wired up for these existential events. I assume the guys that flew the planes into the World Trade Center felt something very much like what I did in that moment. That doesn't mean that God was giving them that feeling. I think the more logical explanation is that we humans just have something in us that needs to believe in something when all hope feels lost. And when we find that thing to believe in, we experience a sort of relief, a religious experience. When faced with a situation that feels hopeless, we still want to do something. And once we do something, even if that something has no impact on the initial problem, we still feel relief. Since we're humans, we often attribute that sense of relief to the thing we just did, even if it was entirely disconnected from the relief we experienced. Give a room full of people a placebo pill, tell them it's a placebo pill, and some portion of them will still swear they experienced positive effects, and they'll want more of it. Humans are forever chronic self-deceivers. That's largely what addiction is. We're solving a problem like trauma or anxiety or depression, but we're doing it in a way that the outside world can clearly see is ineffective, yet it still brings us relief. I start with this story because I'm a human, like you, and like everyone else who's had an experience like this one. Of course, some of us use those experiences for good, and some of us use them for ill, like the September 11th example. But everyone who's had this experience tends to think it's real, just like I thought mine was real for a long time. So if we run into an example of someone or someones thinking they found a solution to their problems based solely on the fact that it worked for them when nothing else seemed to, and if that thing that they swear works doesn't have a lick of statistical data to support the claim that it works, well, that doesn't mean that I'm calling those people who invented the thing frauds or liars. They might honestly believe that it works. It might honestly have worked for them, given what we know about placebos, even if it doesn't work. This is a long-winded way of starting this episode by saying if something works for you, if it brings you success in life, use it. And if it doesn't, be willing to set it down and look for a better solution to your problems. Which brings us to 12-step programs, the real story of today's episode.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
But to really understand 12-step programs at all, you have to understand AA, the original 12-step program. And to understand AA, we have to take a brief trip through our cultural history with alcohol. Humans have been drinking it for between 10 to 15,000 years. One of the leading thoughts about why we love alcohol so much today has to do with our ability to metabolize far more alcohol than other animals, which means we could have survived during times of famine by eating boozy fruit left on forest floors that might have killed other animals if they'd eaten it. For a long time, alcohol was seen as a gift from God. Don't forget, Jesus' first miracle in the New Testament Gospels was turning water into wine for a group full of party guests who'd already been drinking for days. Humans have been drinking alcohol for a long time. Now that alcohol was weak. It was beer or honey mead or wine. But in the Middle Ages, Middle Eastern people started to distill alcohol by boiling off the water to make it stronger. They made liquor. Eventually, Catholic monks and then others picked up the process while traveling, and by the 1400s to 1500s, most places on the globe were starting to see potent potables weave themselves into culture. People weren't just drinking beer and wine anymore. They were drinking booze. So let's fast forward to the 1600s, and let's pick up the story on the shores of the so-called New World. Arriving colonists got to work as soon as they landed, planting hops, barley, and rye, things they could use to brew beer. See, water was pretty unsafe to drink in England at the time, and forms of alcohol had come to stand in as a safe alternative. Hard apple cider became a beverage of choice because it was also safer than water. During meals, kids would drink a weaker beer called ship's ale, around 3% alcohol, and it wasn't even seen as something that would get you drunk. It was just what you drank. The entire colonial Americas lived off alcohol. We needed it to survive. And unsurprisingly, taverns became a town square. Church was held in taverns. Business was done in taverns. Court was held in taverns. Alcohol was just a part of life. But again, most of that alcohol was still brewed beer and fermented cider, no more than 6 to 7% alcohol by weight. So things went well with alcohol until around the 1800s. By that time, liquor that was 40 to 50% alcohol by weight had become big business. By 1807, there were 40 distilleries in Boston, but only 2 breweries. From 1780 to 1820, average consumption of hard liquor in the colonies doubled. And all that drunkenness caused all those social problems that it always does. Lost jobs, bad parenting, fights, arrests. This substance, alcohol, which had been a huge part of American life since the beginning, was suddenly starting to look like the bad guy. By the early 1800s, the temperance movement began, originally aimed at helping people temper their drinking, meaning drink less, not stop drinking altogether. But eventually that would change to today's clean and sober for 90 days rhetoric. This is where Carrie Nation, whose nickname was Carrie Hatchet, showed up in our nation's history. She's the woman on the episode artwork with a hatchet in one hand and a Bible in the other, and she would show up in bars across the West and just start smashing their liquor bottles. That recipe, a hatchet and a Bible, would become the framework for AA. religion plus abstinence.
We beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now.
Now, the idea that alcoholism or addiction was a disease, that didn't really exist prior to the 1800s. I mean, sure, sometimes people drank too much, but it was seen as either a moral shortcoming or some kind of evil demonic possession. Those were the two frameworks we had for understanding why some people seemed unable to control themselves when they took an intoxicating substance. The first person to play with the idea of addiction as a disease was a man named Benjamin Rush, but he didn't really offer any treatment into the disease, and instead chose to just focus on the ways that this disease was guaranteed to kill us if we didn't stop drinking. Now, by the 1830s, the temperance movement had moved into this space of addiction as a disease, and it had brought with it a solution: religion, righteousness, morality. And that rang true with a lot of people in the United States. By 1837, the temperance movement had 1 million people participating. Now, hand in hand with this religious idea of treatment coming in the form of morality, or of God, or of going to church, there ran a parallel narrative of medicine being a treatment. Although, for a long time, the medicine that was prescribed was quackery at its best. In 1879, Dr. Leslie Keeley became the first person on record to claim not only that alcoholism was a disease, but that he could cure it. And even though he had no statistical evidence to back up his claims of success, he told the world that 95% of the people he treated never went back to alcohol. By the end of World War I, what had come to be known as the Keeley method, where you just take people, lock them up and detox them, and sometimes offer them different snake oil treatments, it fell out of style. And it was replaced by what came to be known as inebriate hospitals, where people would go to dry out. These were the sorts of places that would later inspire the book and the accompanying movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And it wasn't just addicted folks that wound up there. People with all sorts of mental and physical health conditions wound up there, and they were often treated horribly, given forced lobotomies. Between 1907 and 1913, many states passed laws mandating sterilization for what they called, quote, defectives, including mentally ill people or alcoholics. And because of all that, around the turn of the century, as the 1900s showed up, these facilities started to go out of style. In their place came the passage of the 18th Amendment. And all sales and transportation and manufacturing of alcohol in the United States was outlawed. Although, notably, this didn't affect rich folks all that much, because you were still allowed to possess and consume alcohol as long as you'd purchased it before the amendment went into effect. Many rich folks didn't have to stop drinking at all. That lasted until 1933. And what this managed to do is replace all of the treatments that had been peddled up to this point, from religion to inpatient treatment where you're dried out and then sent home, to different snake oil treatments, to even early psychoanalysis, and it replaced it all with a legal structure. The state would now punish people who use substances they weren't supposed to, instead of families or cultural groups coming together to treat them in their own way. Now, when the 18th Amendment was ratified, Bill Wilson, who would come to be seen as the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, he was 24 years old, and he wasn't exactly a well-adjusted young man. He'd been raised in a rich family and given all the trappings of wealth, but he'd been repeatedly abandoned by both of his parents. His dad and his grandfather were also both well-known alcoholics. And notably, his grandpa had experienced what he called a miracle atop Mount Aeolus, where he stopped drinking after experiencing a connection with God and talking about visions he saw up there. Bill Wilson was always a weirdly religious person, and his religion would come to inform AA, although not until after the 21st Amendment was passed in 1933 and alcohol was re-legalized. A year after that amendment passed, in 1934, Bill Wilson wound up in a rehab facility for treating alcoholics 4 different times. But between his 3rd and 4th visits, he bumped into an organization called the Oxford Group. And this is where his thinking really started to come together. Because before this, Bill had 2 separate identities that he felt were in conflict. First, he was a Christian, but then he had this other identity as an addicted person. He smoked until the day he died, he always struggled with eating too much sugar, and of course, the main thing, he was an alcoholic, self-described. The Oxford Group brought all these ideas together, and it would come to be the standard form that he would follow when he later wrote the Big Book, AA's Bible. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing, and that was what Bill Wilson would later come to describe as a spiritual awakening. That happened with Bill Wilson during his 4th time in treatment, where he claims to have had a vision where he saw all of the drunks in the world holding hands and supporting one another.
I felt myself filled with the consciousness of the presence of Spirit, of God. A great peace stole over me. And there I laid and reveled in this new and loving consciousness.
But what's often lost from that story is that Bill Wilson was on what was at the time called the belladonna cure. He was in a rehab facility being given strong doses of what amounts to a psychedelic. That's probably what initiated the spiritual experience that would come to define his recovery. And that wasn't the last time that Bill Wilson would use and swear by psychedelics, although I'll circle back around to LSD in a minute. After that day, he claims he never drank again, and he attributes his success with sobriety to that experience. Of course, he seldom mentioned that it was the exact same experience his grandpa had shared with him and with others, but nonetheless, that came to be the foundation of the movement that would later become AA. AA and related 12-step programs are incredibly religious at their roots. That's a big part of the reason that they feel so comfortable to many who live in a culture like the United States. Most of us have a lot of familiarity with religion, even if we've never practiced it ourselves. And most of us have practiced it ourselves. So along with Bill Wilson's spiritual experience, his religious awakening, came his introduction to the Oxford Group. And it's easy to spot how the Oxford Group's 6 steps are incredibly related to Bill Wilson's 12 steps. He allegedly chose 12 because of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Again, religion is woven throughout. The Oxford Group's 6 steps are a complete deflation, dependence on God, a moral inventory, confession, restitution, and continued work with others in need. It's a distilled version of the 12-step model. It didn't matter that there was no statistical analysis, no data set to show that it actually worked. Bill said it worked for him, and it worked for some of the people near to him, so he wrote the book. And then people started to write articles about the book. There was a Liberty article, that's a magazine that was actually owned by a member of the Oxford Group, someone who later became an AA trustee themselves. And then there was a huge article in 1941 in a magazine called the Saturday Evening Post. That article is actually still passed around in some AA circles today because the authors were so gracious to AA, despite the fact that there was no statistical data to show that it actually worked. And this is where Marty Mann shows up, a rich white woman who'd struggled with alcoholism herself and had found Bill Wilson's book helpful in her finding sobriety. She took a bunch of money, put together a massive PR campaign, opened some nonprofits to give her cause legitimacy, and then went on a media tour across the country. So Bill Wilson publishes the 12-step book in 1941, and membership tripled to 6,000 people by 1942. By 1975, 500,000 people, and by the early 1980s, 1 million people had joined AA. And again, this was due in large part to Marty Mann's media blitz. Her nonprofit was called the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependency, And once it was open, she could then travel across the country and give lectures to medical organizations or to groups of people that were dealing with addiction in their own lives. 80 years later, AA and other 12-step programs do this clever trick where they point to their history in the United States as evidence that the program works. I mean, it's been around 80 years. Of course it works, right? But that early illusion of success was based largely in Marty Mann's ability to get the word out, to use her nonprofit organization to make people believe that what she was saying was the answer to their problems.
Dr. Tebow came into New York. He had been reading this manuscript, and he thought maybe this was something that would help me. And he handed it to me, and the title of it was Alcoholics Anonymous. When I started reading the book, I was thrilled to death, because here for the first time I found out what was wrong, and that this was a program to deal with the obsession of the mind that drove you to drink against your own will very often when you didn't want to. At last, I could understand why it was that I couldn't go back to drinking the way I used to. Something had changed, and I would never be able to take alcohol normally. And I accepted it.
So this brings us to the real question. Does AA work? Some of the most basic statistics here might shed the most light on this situation. For instance, what really got me interested in this debate was not only that I was in multiple 12-step groups years ago, and they seemed to make the problem worse whenever I really got involved. They didn't work for me. But also if you just look at the rates of what's called spontaneous remission in people who use drugs or alcohol. The amount of people who just stop using in any given year without any treatment whatsoever. There's been lots of studies done on this, and they don't all necessarily agree 100%. But if you take the low end and the high end of these studies, between 3.7% and 18% of addicted people stop using their drug in any given year with no treatment whatsoever. We just age out. If you compare that to the rates of people who walk into a 12-step program intending on working through the program and trying to be sober, about 5 to 8% of those people manage to stay sober for 1 year. Those aren't very good odds. If you take just the low numbers of both data sets, 3.7% of addicted people stop using drugs in a given year, compared to 5% of people who deliberately walk into a 12-step program and devote themselves to working the steps. About a 1.3% increase. In 1980, J.M. Brandsma split people into 3 different groups, one given AA, another one given one-on-one behavioral therapy, and a third group, the control group, given whatever they want. No treatment, some treatment, personal therapy. At the 3-month follow-up period, researchers found significantly more drinking in the AA group than in any others. AA group members were 5 times more likely to binge drink than the control group, and 9 times more likely to binge drink than the one-on-one therapy group. So as soon as you start setting up studies that don't just look at AA compared to nothing, but that look at AA compared to other treatments, you almost always notice that it fails to live up to anything like what it promises. But what are the studies that do show success? Well, the biggest one, the one AA members cite most often, is from the Cochrane collaboration from 2006. And they do show that people that attend AA have a pretty fair success rate. But they started that study with people who once attended, leaving out anyone who's never attended. In other words, they didn't compare people that walk into AA to people that don't walk into AA and then measure success based on what happens after that. They just looked at people who were already there. Now, it might not sound like a big deal, but think about this. Why do people walk into an AA meeting? It's the same reason that for many, AA feels successful, because they feel like they're doing something when they don't know what to do. They feel like I felt in that jail cell. People usually walk into AA when they've reached a point where they want to make a change. And when they walk into AA, they find an environment with people who are like them and who will support them. They find an identity that they can dedicate themselves to. They find a place where they can link into an organization that will offer them benefits and levels of respect when they continue to go without the substance of their choice. It's a social network with a deep identity embedded in it, and that's most likely what accounts for the success that AA can show. Studies also show that AA attendance does not reduce drug or alcohol use. active participation in AA does. Again, that might seem like a small difference, but it points back to what I was just saying about connection with a support group and identity. Now here's the problem, especially in a culture like ours that tends to look at 12-step programs as the only option. If you've ever watched a show like Intervention, the go-to in the United States is for families to sit down addicted people and to dump on them this ultimatum where they either go to a 12-step treatment program or they are cut off from family support. Now, people who never attend AA might not statistically do better than people who do when it comes to maintaining sobriety, but study after study also shows that AA dropouts do much worse than people who never attend AA. And again, that sort of makes sense in a culture where AA and 12-step mentality is peddled as the cure-all, as the only solution. If you've lived here your whole life and you've been told this thing out there is what you do when you're addicted, and then you finally, after putting it off for years, go to that thing and try to do it, but it doesn't work for you, well, it would make sense to feel even more powerless and to just go back to the substance use, to give up. And on those grounds, it's easy to make the argument that requiring anybody to go to a 12-step program, whether you do that through legal mechanisms like drug court or through pressure heaped on people by their families, it's making the problem worse. Again, if 12-step programs work for you, keep using them. If a medicine works for you, keep using it. But knowing that forcing somebody to go to AA or to any treatment program when they're not yet ready is likely to make their addiction worse, that means we should be going out of our way to prevent that from happening, which is about the opposite of what we do in the United States. To this day, we continue to pressure people we care about into 12-step programs under the belief that it's the only option they have. It's not. Look, addictions are about finding something that feels like it works to make you feel better about a situation or numerous situations, and then using that thing far too much until it takes over other aspects of your life and it stops working as well. So while we could argue that going to a 12-step program and knuckling down and working the steps, which, by the way, are in and of themselves incredibly religious, most of them mention God and a belief in God, while we could argue that that might be one way to help people stop using drugs or alcohol, the idea of treating a disorder or a disease, as we often call it, even though it's not, by forcing people to attend group sessions with religious mentality, it does nothing to address the underlying root cause of addiction. We use drugs or alcohol for a reason, and like all human reasons, it's usually buried behind a wall that we're not supposed to see past. It's really hard for people to psychoanalyze themselves. And that's what we need if we're ever going to stop doing something toxic and find a more healthy behavior pattern. And that's where 12 steps fall short. Now I get it. We're in a capitalist culture. You can hold these meetings anywhere. They're free. There's no big leadership that has to be paid. Nobody has to go get buku degrees to run the meetings. It's a community that supports one another, and that's great. Again, if it works for you, keep doing it. But it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work for most people. And the reason it doesn't work is the same reason that it got so big in the first place. It's so couched in religious ideology that so many in the United States share that it just kind of feels right. And for many, it ties into their original religious identity and works with it to get them into this new group where they succeed in life, where they get rid of toxic habits or they minimize them. But damn, here we are 29 minutes in, and all I've done is poo-poo AA, although I've tried to be really clear that it's a good tool for those who dig it. It's just not all purpose. So here's my 3-minute summary linking all of this together and getting to the promised LSD piece about Bill W. Like me with my religious experience in that prison cell years back, Bill W. also rethought his original understanding of his religious breakthrough, but not until 20 years after he quit drinking. At the time, psychedelics were still legal. States didn't start outlawing them until the 60s, and the feds didn't get to it until 1970. LSD had received a ton of attention for its incredible success in treating not only alcoholism, but depression, which Bill struggled with his entire life. So he took LSD and became a huge proponent, at least for a minute. But unfortunately, the dogma of 12 steps had already solidified, and any intoxicating substances were looked down on, so he was pressured to avoid talking about it. But he clearly realized his original religious experience was just as important as he'd always thought. It just wasn't necessarily from God. And more importantly, that was a good thing. You don't have to be religious or pretend to be religious to have a breakthrough that 12-step programs often manage to instigate in a roundabout way. Wilson discovered it was more about ego, that part of you that Freud described as in charge of managing what we show the world and how we navigate our subconscious desires and thoughts. Ego is in charge of our automatic responses and the thoughts that we have hundreds of times every day without really realizing it. When our ego goes away, like happens on a good dose of psilocybin or LSD, we can look at the world in a way that feels new and rethinkable. And most of us come to recognize our existence in something much larger than ourselves. That's what recovery looks like, no matter what route one takes. Alcohol is just a drug, one that we've made much more potent in recent centuries than it ever was during the majority of our evolution as a species that has always apparently used it rather liberally. It's natural for us to struggle with addictions when potencies of natural chemicals are artificially inflated. It's the same thing that's continuing to happen with fentanyl, cocaine, meth, K2, and other drugs. That's why the war on drugs makes addictions worse. All humans have a different pathway to success because all humans have a different pathway to addiction. Psychotherapy helps us discover what is driving our specific actions and desires. Meditation helps us spot connections and habits that we might have missed. Medication shortcuts the pathway to ego dissolution or to depression reduction, which has proven so valuable to many. In AA, like any social group that values membership and encourages people to thrive in a specific space with strategic incentives, is successful because it offers identity and group membership. It's just not the only way to success. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
And then I remember crying out, if there is a God, will he show himself? And then came the miracle, the great central experience of my whole life. The room instantly lit up in a blinding glare of white light. I was seized by an ecstasy such as I had never known. It seemed to me that I then stood on a mountaintop where a great clean wind was blowing. I thought to myself, but this is not air, this is spirit. This is the God of the preacher. How long I remained in this state, I just cannot say. And again, I have no words to describe what it was like. At length, however, I found myself on the bed, but now I was in a new world. A world in which everything was right, despite the wrongs of the world I had been living in. I felt myself filled with the consciousness of the presence of Spirit, of God. A great peace stole over me. And there I laid and reveled in this new and loving consciousness.
If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime, that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.